everyone. Excited to be here today as a guest. I'm always really interested in hearing, and I think it's a beautiful alignment with our political party, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we don't align on, but it's so refreshing when you have those core issues that is being spruiked by someone that has so much integrity and background. So, John Blackburn, welcome. And John, I think I thought maybe I'd labour through the introduction, but I think it's better if you told us about yourself, because there's a fair bit there to read and get through what you've achieved in your time.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Not a problem. So, look, I'm a retired Air Vice Marshal. I was the Deputy Chief of the Air Force many moons ago. Had 43 years in the Air Force. That's a pretty big deal. It's a long time ago. But, flew fighter airplanes, did a lot of strategy stuff, had great fun. When I got out of the Air Force, I sort of realised how little I understood of how the world works, particularly things like logistics. I assumed it away. So, for the last decade, I spent a lot of time looking into these areas. Of course, fuel security is one of those. And that's why I'm pretty public about my concerns, because it's about our security as a nation.
And you would have, like many of us, thought, I'm sure they're probably doing a pretty good job with these things. I'm living all right, and the world seems to be functioning quite well.
Things sort of happen, and when there's not a crisis, and often you assume that people outside your organisation work in a similar way to you do. And in defence is pretty thorough at looking at risk. But when I got out, I found there's so many assumptions made that was a bad assumption that I made myself.
And I'm just backing into the introduction, mate. I see those that glider in the background. You've downgraded from the F-18s to.
So I started on this. I started on this, which was Mirages, and then I went to F-18s and a whole bunch of other airplanes. But nowadays, this is what I just do for fun in the country.
Less power.
It's got a 20 horsepower engine, but that's only to get home if you run out of lift, because you don't want to put that in a paddock if you can avoid it.
Mate, I would love to spend the hour just talking aircraft with you. As you know, I'm a rank amateur with a sum total of about 600 or 700 hours now. But
that's not an amateur. That's pretty good.
Oh well, I absolutely love it, and I would love to tap your brain on that front, but I won't indulge myself there. So yeah, John, you were saying you came out of the Defence Force, you saw gaps in. And I mean, it's difficult to quantify even talking to you now, and because it's once you scratch the surface on logistics, it started opening up other cracks in how we organise ourselves, our economy, and in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you find out that 90% of your fuels are imported, 90% of your medicines are imported, nearly all of your masks and medical equipment imported, huge billions of dollars of fertilizers is imported, and you know what? We don't have any control of the shipping coming towards us because it's foreign flagged. And you go, hang on a second. You just don't realise that until you dig into it.
Where do you have a view on where these cracks started appearing on do we call it self-sufficiency, or some of these key issues of being able to manage through a crisis? How do we define that?
I think there's two problems. One is that this neoliberal approach that you talk about, but you go back to the time of Reagan and Thatcher, and it was small government, leave it all to the market.
Now, it made a lot of sense at the time.
It did, and it makes a lot of sense because you didn't want anything government owned.
Yeah.
But when you overdo it, what you find out is if you keep chasing the lowest cost, that comes at a very, very high price in a crisis. And often when you discover it, it's too late to do much about it. This has happened quite common around the world, but quite a few countries take a lot more interest in it. The Nordic countries are a good example. They take a lot more interest in their resilience. The United States has woken up to its energy problems in recent years and said, hang on, we've got to do something about it. But one of the other problems is that by and large, we've got a really complacent culture in Australia, but she'll be right, because we've had it so good for so long. Trouble is the world's a more complicated, dangerous place, and that's not going to do us any good if we keep doing that.
Yeah, I think everyone listening to you gets a sense of that. Is that she'll be right, mate, and perhaps would you think that the economists maybe just had too much of a say in that process without some strategic advisors that say, well, hang on, that I can see what you're trying to do there with your opening up the markets and cheaper costs and globalising our trade, and I see what you're trying to do there, but let's think about some of these other issues.
Yeah, there's something funny happened with our politics. So some of the analysis you read, you go back to, say, Hawke, Keating and Howard, so both sides of politics,
They adopted the Reagan and Thatcher sort of
Well, they did, but they did some really
ideologies.
brave decisions about our economy when they floated the dollar and the GST and a whole bunch of other things. It was very difficult to do, but they were looking at longer term needs rather than short term populism. But about the time that Kevin Rudd came in, and ever since, what seems to have happened is been the parties become nearer term focused, particularly on the next election. Half the time they were stabbing the leaders in the back, so you didn't get continuity. And it's
Yeah.
created a culture in Canberra or at the federal political level that's very short sighted, and it's about putting the other party down. And I don't see that understanding of the longer term, because talking to people like John Hewson, who was Fraser's advisor and worked with the other side of politics as well, he said back in those days there was a lot of bipartisan agreement that if we didn't, as Australians, address the change in the world economy, then we were going to left behind. So we need a bit more brave decision making at the political level.
Do you think, John? I mean, we're probably just delving in the world of politics and economics here, but I mean, what this is where I think it's an interesting alignment of where I see we have now, because I was sort of brought up. I came in, I became, I guess, politically aware through the '90s. We'd start reading articles and taking interest, and I was always seeing myself as a counterpoint to neoliberalism and those values that sort of came with Howard and Keating. But to put that in context, I grew up in a regional area, and I think it's pretty safe to say now, with the benefit of hindsight, that they walked around with a hammer, and pretty much every problem they saw in the economy was a nail. And it's privatisation of some industries and utilities where you didn't have the competition or the critical mass in the regional areas to operate it, so they developed these artificial competition for railway networks and telecommunications, electricity, and it became quickly dysfunctional in rural and remote areas. So I sort of was questioning the merits from another area, but we both landed in the same place, and now just saying, well, crikey, here's a problem.
Yeah. So we've waited for the problem to manifest, even though a lot of people were saying, just watch what's happening in rural Australia. As the farms sort of go larger, you've got less people out there. What happens to those regional population centres? The last thing we want is everybody to migrate to the cities. That's going to give us a hell of a social problem, and it does take away resilience. Because if we can't do what we do in the country areas and keep going there, then we're going to become even more import dependent.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that. Now, I'm probably pulling away from where I want to talk to you about here, but it's so highly relevant. I mean, two issues that came out in the last month or two in Queensland state politics was daylight savings, and the other one was there was an announcement made for another, I think it was another 3 or 4 billion, was it, in southeast Queensland to improve livability in Brisbane. And one of my recent conversations, one of the big mine operators was, well, we're a couple 100,000 tonnes down because we can't attract labour out here to work, to operate the mines, to feed into the economy. And usually when you say, well, how do you attract labour back out there? Well, you need to enhance livability in the regions. I mean, that's only one element of the problem, but it's a pretty strong manifestation. And then that ties in with the daylight savings, because it's pretty hard to attract someone to live somewhere where you're putting the kids to bed in a 40-degree day at 8 o'clock at night. You still got sunlight out there, so it's
it's definitely different worlds between the cities and the country. I've spent a fair bit of time on my sister and brother-in-law's farm. They've been farmers for 4 decades, and you see a very different world through their eyes, the challenges, the struggles, and that sort of stuff over the years, and how the industry changed. They were in dairy, from what happens in the city. So there's completely different mindsets out there. And we need to have a pretty hard conversation about, well, what do we want to be able to be like in 10 and 20 years? Not just the next election.
So, John, to me, you're a pretty precious commodity insofar as you've had the time and resources to look at this stuff. I remember listening to you at a biofuels conference in Sydney, perhaps 7 years ago, I think, on behalf of the NRMA, when you were talking about fuel security. And I was captured then for the things you were saying. But you've had a long time to stand back and have a look at, and you've had the benefit of being such a high position in our national defence. So share with us, let's talk about, say, fuel security is a
Yeah,
big one at the moment. People
yeah,
people suddenly become aware of our fuel security issue because they're paying too much to the petrol bowser, which
yeah.
has been great. Talk to us a little bit about where we stand in Australia on fuel security.
So what happened? I started looking at this after I left full-time service. I was still in the reserve and started to learn how much we imported. And I just asked a few basic questions. What could interrupt that? Because most of us assume if you go down the garage, there'll be fuel there, and that it's not just about the fuel you get. Our whole society basically works on diesel. So it's the trucks going around, the deliveries in the city, the whole supply chain out in the country, farming, everything works on diesel. And then
Yep.
when I found out that, we got as low as 12 days of diesel in the country back in 2014, and I saw the Geelong refinery go down because of a power supply problem, the Altona was down for maintenance, and they were running out of diesel in Gippsland and Western Victoria within 2 days, and that was in
Yep.
the middle of trying to take the crops off. So I
Yep.
asked a few basic questions. How come the stocks are so low? Or people in the industry said, well, some companies operating under a US financial system want to reduce their stock levels, this is the fuel companies, at the end of their financial year. Happened to coincide with the crop coming off. So anyway, my brother-in-law's trying to get ready for the crop. He and the other farmers were talking about driving to New South Wales with their utes with the big tanks on the back and say, well, we've got to get some fuel, otherwise we can't get the crop off. Now, to them, this is like $100,000 loss or something, at least, for small farmers. To a big oil company, whatever. So I realised then that this just-in-time approach, without thinking about what it means for people, is not just about farmers and that, it's about the way our life works. So I got quite agitated about it. And I've spoken to energy ministers over the years from both sides of politics, and both Labor and Liberal ones in the past have told me to go away, stop bothering them, just worry about defence issues. That got me more agitated. So it's about being assured not only of your ability to get fuel, but everything in your society keeps working. And if there is an interruption, what does that look like? And that's why I've been focused
Yep.
on it.
It's really interesting because some of you talk about that disruption, and that you'd think if you most common sense people out there in Voterland would sort of look at that situation and say, well, if you're the energy minister in Victoria, or New South Wales, I guess, for that matter, but if you're the energy minister there or the national energy minister, you would flag that as a concern, and I don't see where the risk would be in saying, here's a problem to the people, and into your political enemy say, look, I've identified a problem, I'm not sure what the answer is, but we're going to have to look at this. I've always failed to grasp what the risk is there for
Okay,
the politicians in charge.
So where the way the market works, that the oil and fuel lobby, the Australian Institute of Petroleum, that I was interacting with in the past, are very powerful, huge amounts of money and influence. So what they do is they influence both sides of politics, and they keep saying there's not a problem, the market's diverse, we can handle this and that, nothing's gone wrong, well, apart from small interruptions. And so the problem that I've seen with federal politicians, if they admit there's a problem anywhere, then immediately the press goes, well, how are you going to fix it? Well, I've got to tell you, there's problems that we know about that we've got no idea how to fix yet, but the very first step in fixing a problem is accepting you've got one.
Yep.
The first energy minister in the last decade to accept we've got a problem was Angus Taylor, but he only did that when it became evident the last of our refineries were about to close in late 2020. And that, sadly, is too little too late. But at least he admitted, in part, there was a problem. So it's a political, cultural issue.
Yep.
That unless it schwacks you in the face and you go, ooh, it stopped, there's no incentive there to open up a problem and say, I'm not sure what I'm going to do about it. And oh, by the way, it's going to cost us money.
So-
There's the problem.
So, John, can we draw that out a bit further then? And, let's say there is a conflict that starts permeating out of, say Ukraine or out of China. Let's say there's some type of conflict, there are disruptions in supply. What's our capacities here in Australia to deal with that, and what are the risks there?
Yeah.
Give us a few scenarios of if there was major disruption.
Now, what we've got in Australia is about 3 weeks of diesel and 4 weeks of petrol. The government's never mandated stock levels. In other words, they haven't told industry your minimum stock levels. Most other developed countries have. Minimum stock levels are going to be introduced, thanks to Angus Taylor, starting in 2024 and slowly going up. But still, just think about 3 weeks of diesel and 4 weeks of petrol. The trouble is that's an aggregated figure. So in some areas you might have a lot less. In other areas you might have a bit more, and the data doesn't show you where it is. So there's the first problem. Now, we know we've run out within 2 or 3 days at various times, and we did see even in Western Australia, when they had a bit of a delay, that they were having problems within 2 or 3 days a couple of
I
years.
remember that.
Okay, so now you talk about what could everything going on in Ukraine, etc. cause. Well, Russia has about 10% of the world's export oil capacity. So if you take that off the market, there's going to be a rapid reorganisation of supply that'll increase demand and prices go up, like we're seeing. But a lot of people think that the main way that you could have a fuel supply interruption is a war here, and will stop our supply chains. I'm not as worried about that. There's a lot of other ways you could lose it. In 2019, I gave a presentation to a Navy group on maritime trade. They'd asked me to look at it because I was not Navy, I was in the Air Force, and I could have a fresh look of eyes. And in 2019, I was saying, if we have a global pandemic, that could take out the supply chains, the shipping chains, and if they get taken out, we're done within a couple of weeks. Well, the pandemic we had in 2020 was not as fatal as what was being anticipated by a lot of the analysts in the world. That doesn't mean that pandemic's not going to come in the future. It is a risk. So if something takes the supply chain, well, one thing could be, as I said, pandemic. Another thing is what we're going to see as the biggest problem out of bushfires, floods, climate change, the pandemic, and the war is major damage to our global economic systems. So our economic systems were reasonable. Our public debt levels weren't that high. So we've had a lot of increase in public debt in Australia, but it's still manageable compared to other countries. But we're now back up at probably the first or second highest private debt levels in the world. So that makes our economy fairly vulnerable because we've all gone and got cheap loans, haven't we? So there's one aspect. But now let's look at the wider world. What's happening with all these things concurrently is damaging the global economy. Debt levels are going through the roof, confidence problems there, supply chains are interrupted, manufacturing. So one of the other big risks identified by another think tank in Europe I'm a part of was what happens if we have a failure of credit. So you can have all these debt levels and problems, but all somebody's got to go is, hang on, call back in the debt, and it can cascade. This apparently happened at the start of World War I. But the Allies had anticipated and prepared, and they knew what they'd do if the credit failed. Here's the case. Think about all these ships going around the world, the shipping system. They're bought on credit. The fuel that powers them comes on credit. And what they're shipping around, the supplies, are bought on credit. So if we have a problem in the credit system, that can take out large parts of our supply chain. If the global supply chain contracts as a result of that, we are not on a major shipping route. The major shipping route runs, basically from the Middle East across through Asia, across to America. We're on a side route. And that's where the problem becomes because we won't be a priority for shipping. I mean, I was talking to an agricultural commodity guy the other day, and they were saying, look, we're producing all this wheat. We're going to have a real hard time finding the shipping available to export it because we won't get the priority. So all these things can actually affect your supply chain. It doesn't have to be war. And where we're headed now, as a result of pandemics, climate, and the war, is we're heading to more and more risky economic situations. Now, we can't wait until it happens to react. We're going to have to think about it and prepare. So what you want to make sure is in critical areas, we've got enough supplies and capability manufacturing in Australia to keep our society running whilst that interruption might happen. And you can't do that just with stocks. You've got to have some capability to manufacture. And the critical supply chains have to be what we're calling is trusted. Do not have a critical supply chain with a country that you can't trust, because if things go wrong, guess what happens?
So staying on the shipping, like what sort of role does it play? Like say we're in a situation where we're impacted by a conflict or again a disruption. How much of that shipping is imported goods, or how much do we rely on it for domestic transport, for taking fuel from one state to another, or grain to another state? How does that work?
If you're in the farming area, what would I be worrying about if I'm sitting there with supply chains? Well, fuel is obvious. Fertilizers, billions of dollars coming in, and our fertilizer industry is closing. I think the Intertek plant in Queensland is supposed to close at the end of the year. Farm machinery, vehicles. Try and buy a car now. There's 6 to 12 months. Chemicals. You can't do farming and a lot of this stuff without chemicals, and a lot are imported. Think about bitumen for the roads. There's only one place in Australia makes a bit, and we're importing huge amounts from overseas. And then the whole logistics chain, the trucking and everything else that we have in Australia, requires imported fuels. So when you think about the volume, just the data back from, say, 2018, in that 1 year, we brought in $45 billion worth of machinery, $42 billion worth of fuels, $42 billion worth of vehicles, and $2 billion of fertilizers. And going the other way, we're exporting 124 billion of fuels, a lot of stuff off the Northwest Shelf, a lot of iron ore, a lot of chemicals, and a lot of meat, a lot of agricultural products. So if that starts to have a problem, it affects what's coming in, it affects what we're able to send out.
Yep.
And when you start to dig in, you start to think that there's a couple of key food ingredients, and a lot of our foods require imported ingredients. If that gets interrupted, it really is going to disrupt us. But it's such a complicated thing to get a picture, and everybody works in a stovepipe. There's one people looking at one piece and one looking at the other piece. Glue it together, you got to go, this could unravel pretty quickly, so let's take it seriously and anticipate what we need to do so it doesn't close us down.
Yep, that's interesting. So you mentioned something that resonated with me there was the Intertek Pivot
Yeah.
plant closing down. I had a personal experience with them when I first entered Parliament when they were rolling out the LNG industry, and everyone was still heavily embedded in the, free market ideologies where we don't want to see any impact on trade, and this needs to, the imperative was fluidity between trade, which worked very well in hands of the big gas companies coming in that wanted to break into the market and for the first time export our gas off the East Coast. But Intertek Pivot, who are a big gas industrial user, who at that time made the decision to reposition the plant that was about to be built in Geelong and built it over in the United States.
Yeah, Louisiana, I believe.
They painted the picture of what is happening now to me then 8 years ago. And I think I can safely say I was a lone wolf in Queensland Parliament saying this seems to be an enormous error. I think you've made a huge mistake. No one ever argued with me in Parliament, actually. No one would ever say they would, but they would herald the bountiful industry that was the gas industry in its construction phase, and I emphasise the word construction phase, and they heralded the lucrative royalties that never came. What was your observations with the rollout of the gas industry, which has been hugely disrupted?
Again, I'd describe it as strategic stupidity because West Australia's got the reservation policy and that's made a difference from them.
Yep.
If we have natural resources, it is crazy if we don't specify a reservation in the natural resources we have for domestic use first, and then the rest can go to the market. And Senator Faulkner, who was Defence Minister a long time ago, was one of the two Defence Ministers I had a lot of respect for. He stood up at a conference once and said, there's a difference between us and America. America prioritises domestic energy first and exports second. Australia prioritises exports first and domestic second. Now, that's an idea that an economist might applaud, but if you look at it through a security lens, that's pretty stupid. And so the absence of gas reservation on the East Coast and in the North has led to these cases. A fair bit of some of our fertiliser components come from China and West Sahara, neither of which I'd be calling a trusted supply chain at the moment, or never have. So the fact that we're losing Intertek is absolutely crazy, but it comes from not a state problem. I think whilst West Australia did it, we need a national approach to saying, hang on, we've got all these resources. Let's make sure that we're sustainable, that we're resilient, and then get the best economic benefit we can from the rest. Other countries do that. We just don't seem to think about it.
Yeah, so back on the fuel, I often get the question, well, where does our fuel come from? Because, we know we've got some oil reserves here, but and I mean, a lot of what I know is based on reading some of the material you've put out in the past, but as I understand it, the majority, a large majority of oil comes from the Middle East, but
it's distributed
through Singapore is a big provider of the distilled.
So what happens is the oil supply that we have coming in to our remaining two refineries comes from a lot of diverse sources.
Yeah.
But what we've got coming in there, our refineries produce about 30% of our fuel, 10% of which comes from Australian oil. So 20% of our fuel is imported oil. The remaining part, about 70%, less than that now, but it comes in as refined fuels. Refined fuels are largely from Asia, and they're reliant on Middle East oil for 40% of their supply of oil. that refined fuel percentage is growing. We went from 7 refineries 10 years ago down to 2, so we're bringing in a lot more refined fuels now. So who are the top 3 there? Number 1, number 2 from imports is Singapore and South Korea, and they sometimes exchange position. Number 3 for the amount of refined fuels we bring in is China. There's also a lot of discussion that because China's expanding its industry and can undercut the prices, that they have a likelihood of dominating the refined fuel market in Asia because of lower costs. Don't have to worry about some of the things we do on emissions and environments and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the region will probably become more dependent for a larger share coming from China. So when you look at that, you've got to go, okay, what have we learned or should learn from the Ukrainian war when we've seen Europe so dependent on Russian oil and gas? So what you've got to have a think about is what impact does it have? Well, it's reduced Europe's independence. It's reduced their sovereignty because they are very limited. They can't afford to have that gas supply cut off. Otherwise, they're going to have a major problem in Europe. And they did not diversify their supply adequately in the past when there were proposals to do so. So what we've got to say in here, hang on, are we happy that if the government has identified China as our major security threat, and so we're going to buy over 100 billion of submarines and we're buying more tanks and all this other stuff, if the government, and this is Minister Dutton and also the Prime Minister, said they're the threat, is it really smart that over time we just happily increase our fuel dependence? Because some of the fuels, the critical fuels for the landing helicopter dock ships, those big ones, the aviation fuel on that comes at the moment just from South Korea. So if there's a problem up there, what are we going to do? Can we just stop that for a second and send us some supply of fuel so we can come up and fight? Yeah, this is just stupid. So
well, that ties in. Explain to us the standing agreement they've got. They recently announced that we've got fuel security now in Australia because they've signed this agreement. Talk us through that one, right?
Look, Angus Taylor has a wonderful imagination. So our problem is we've got domestic stocks in Australia. That's the stuff we can use, right? But we're a member of the International Energy Agency. And as a member country, all member countries are supposed to hold 90 days of net imports. Now we're getting into accounting terms, not real stuff. 90 days of net imports so that in a global supply crisis, they can release stocks to the market to manage prices. This is not about getting stocks for our use, it's release the excess stocks so we can stop the price getting out of control. And in the last month that's happened. The IEA member countries have released stocks of oil to try and stop the price growth. And Australia generously released a day and a half of stocks that we had sitting in a US cavern somewhere in the US in their strategic oil stocks. Now, Australia is the only country that doesn't meet its stockholding obligations as a member country of IEA. But the minister is happy to tell us we've got 89 days. So here's what they do. You look at all the oil and fuel, including heating oil you're bringing in, and you subtract all the oil you're exporting. Now, most of the oil we're exporting comes from the Northwest Shelf, and it's a light sweet crude. And we no longer have a refinery in Australia that can process it after Altona closed. So you get this calculation, then you divide it by your days of average use, and you come up with number of days of net imports. And they're about 69. But is that 69 days you can use? No, because we can't use that oil that's coming off the Northwest Shelf. It's going off to Singapore. Then on top of that, we add the stuff we've got overseas. So a day and a half in America, which we'd never be able to use. We have a contract to purchase some stocks in Netherlands to be released to the market in emergency. And here's where the creative accounting comes in. The minister counts the number of days of stocks at sea coming to us that we've ordered. And the IEA says you can't count those because they're not under your control. They're not in the US cavern and they're not in Australia. So what the minister says, we've got 89 days by the way he measures it. And I put this up once and somebody came back to me and said, yeah, well, I'm 6 foot tall by the way I measure it as well. But that's not reality. So let's be careful about these statements and say, what is the real fuel we've got here that we'd have to use in an emergency? And it's 3 weeks.
I think that the statement by the minister reminds me of one of your closing comments there many years ago when I first heard you speak. Our policy was akin to she be right, mate.
She'll be right. Don't you worry about that. The market's...
So, what about even... and speaking hypothetically about disruption in supply, and so let's say, for instance, in time of conflict, what about our internal logistics?
Yeah.
How does that relate to like road rail?
They're a real problem. We can't move fuel by rail anymore except within the mining areas where they've got their own sort of rolling stock. So for some
It's not
reason,
on the rail anymore in
no, it's
northwest New
not.
York. Right?
We've lost the ability to do it. So you basically have foreign-owned ships bringing it into the cities, and then you've got tankers moving it around, trucks. But that can do stuff up and down the east coast, but you're not going to be able to move it across the country. So if you can't move it by rail, the other alternative is foreign flag ships. So you've got to get other countries' ships to move it, as currently we have to bring it in. And that gives you a problem. When they did that MH370 search and rescue from Learmonth, when the Malaysian aircraft disappeared off there, I got told by the people organising that they just about ran West Australia Drive jet fuel just for a search and rescue operation. So the question I started to pose to the politicians was, okay, if the supply chains are this, and like you can only get fuel to our northern fighter base by a 2-lane road by truck, good luck in the wet, how are we going to operate our military from our northern bases if we had a crisis and we wanted to operate at full pace? Yeah, good question, isn't it?
Good question.
So we're a bit dumb. We keep thinking about just in time because it's cheap.
Yeah, so, trying to reflect then on how we land in these situations, I think we can all agree it's a pretty hopeless situation we're in at the moment. But
It's
trying to address them, and obviously I experienced this a bit myself in Parliament, but it's interesting. You think at the point of the gas reserve policy being introduced, surely the people in the mining department and the political advisors must have signalled that, do you realise the problem this creates for us?
No,
and started talking to the people in the trade department. And what's your experience with that? Because you've been exposed to very high levels of government.
Well, I was a bit naive when I first started doing this in 2012, so I went and asked questions, and I went to the energy department. I said, hang on, look at what the refineries are doing. This is, coming downhill. It's going to crash. And I got told by a senior guy in the energy department, don't you worry about that. It's cheaper for us to import refined fuel than make it ourselves. And I looked at him and I said, are you an economist? And he went, yes. And I said, have you got any idea about security? Because I look at a world of just in case because of my background in the military, and these guys were looking about just in time because that makes sense to them. It's cheaper and everything's substitutable. And I realised then that was the advice that ministers were getting. No, it's fine. It's up to so many diverse sources that everything can take care of it. And there was no thinking in there about just in case. And we're seeing some language politically now. So no, they weren't getting that advice. And here's the other problem. You can't solve energy security if you don't think about the economy and think about emissions reductions and all these things that are all linked. There's nowhere in government that I can find that's able to look across all those areas as a system, because you have a department for this and a department for that and a department for something else and a minister for each of these. So what we've got in our federal political system is like, it's all stovepiped. So it's industrial age modelling. Henry Ford did that when he built cars a long, long time ago. They'd be proud of how we do our politics. It's all stovepipes. And you know where the faults happen? The gaps between the stovepipes, because nobody's looking at them.
Good point. Yeah. So, coming to some solutions, and some of those are very difficult, re-establishing refineries and our ability to produce. But what drew me to you initially was my interest, and probably reflecting my father's interest. I inherited that as well, that intrigue with biofuels in the industry, which, is not altogether a solution, but certainly we felt plays a part. How can that assist?
Yeah. Look, it's an important part because there's no simple answer to this. I mean, look, I've got an electric car and solar on the roof, and I'll hear these people saying electric cars are the total solution. No, they're not. They're a part of the solution. And when you come up with a new solution, you've got to say, am I replacing a fuel supply chain limitation with an electric car supply chain problem? So it's not that simple. They are important for a whole bunch of reasons. So when you've got a supply problem, the first thing you ask is, what's happening with my transport demand or whatever demand over time? Now, you start solving the problem at the demand side. How can I reduce demand? And yes, taking as much fuel demand and electrifying it, either through battery vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, or for ships, it's going to be ammonia eventually. Using our electricity system to generate that and grow it will allow us to remove a lot of the import demand that we have for fuel. So we're still going to need fossil fuels for decades. There is no way we're going to transform our society's transport and energy any short of that. So what can we produce in Australia that satisfies some of that fuel demand? And look, gas to liquids is going to be important. There's some good proposals to do that in Northern Territory. Biofuels are going to be important. Recycling waste oil is important. And also there are some technologies in Europe being used that industry tells me they could do smaller scale distributed refining of oil at an affordable rate, because these bigger refineries we've got are not big enough with the technology they've got to be competitive. So you get into biofuels, then you get the argument about, are we taking up arable land that should be for farming and everything else? Well, you see some of the stuff that Cyro's been doing, things like some genetically modified tobacco plants with a huge amount of oil in them. Ethanol can play an important role in there, but what I saw in the last decade was a really interesting PSYOPs campaign by the fossil fuel industry to undermine ethanol. It's an important...
They did a good job. Yeah.
And they did a good job of that, quite clever, to try and restrict the distribution system for ethanol and other areas. But what we've got to say is we're going to need multiple sources. Biofuels are important. Ethanol will be a part of that. How you do that is a really important issue for the states to have a look at. You want to make sure that when you look at renewable production, whether it's solar panels and wind, whatever like that, and then you look at biofuels, and then you look at our food production needs, there's an integrated plan of how we're going to use the land available.
Yes.
And also how we're going to do things like power system, electricity distribution and areas like that. So yes, they're very important because it's something we have control over. In the end, we're still going to have a degree of our fuel that's dependent upon imports. That's reality. Yeah. And in that case, the way of addressing it is you've got to have trusted supply chains, transparent, verifiable, and if it's a critical one, and it's not just fuel, it's medicines and other things, don't have a contract with a country you can't trust. Because if things turn a custard, you're likely to have a problem, because that is their leverage or control over you and your economy and your way of life. So it's a very complicated mix, but there's space in there for everybody. What we need to do is think about it through and have an integrated plan. The other thing I've seen is, look, the states and territories are the ones that do things. The federal government does actually very little. It's got the policy environment and the budget, things like that. Defence does stuff, but that's almost, it does that. But the federal political system doesn't seem to be too good on execution. So the solution to this is going to have the states not just competing with each other, but they're going to have to team up. How do we work as states across the country and say, right, we can produce this over here or this over there, but collectively it gives us resilience as a country for energy supplies, for example, or for food. And I don't see too much of that talk going on, and I don't see the federal level able to bring the team together. But with resilience, there's three important things. And this came from the project I've run for the last 2 years. Number one, you've got to be honest about the risks and be honest about your assumptions. Number two, if you can work out your risks and you've got a plan, you've got to work as a team. Nothing works without a team between industry, the community, the smaller businesses, the political level, and we've got to work as a team across Australia. Number three, if we're going to be resilient, is we've got to prepare rather than just react, and we've got to be able to mobilise our society in a hurry. When we see a problem emerging, then we've got to really... We did it before World War II. We mobilised our society and industry. Our problems are going to be really significant in the next decade or two. We need to mobilise now and start to change the way that we work as a team, because together we've got lots of smart people, we've got a lot of resources in this country. There's one thing missing: leadership.
Well, John, we've got a big job to do here in Queensland, the KAP, with trying to enlighten our government, because their reaction to the problems you've identified last week, their political sell last week was that they're going to give $3,000 to people to buy electric vehicles in response to the high fuel prices. And last we checked, there was a 12-month wait on having taken delivery of electric vehicles. So their ability to handle acute problems leaves a lot to be desired. I'd say that to be kind.
Well, I'm on a 6-month wait for my new electric vehicle. It'll get here in 2 months. But look, what the problem is...
Not bad in the long term. I've got to declare to you too, John, the value of my house that I live in is directly linked to the price of copper, and one of the world's biggest copper producers is in Mount Isa. So I don't dislike electric vehicles, I can tell you.
And there's going to be economic benefits out of it. Look, I have a bit of sympathy for the current leaders in state governments. They've inherited a situation. They're in the middle of a crisis, and all they're doing now is reacting. right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty hard to turn around to your population and go, look, I've got to tell you, we're up the creek. There's no simple solution. It's going to cost us more, and it's going to take a decade to get our act together, but we better start now. Because that for people who are scared and really anxious about what's going on, you can see they want to be reassured that it's all going to be good next year. Well, I'm sorry it's not. But we've got all the ingredients to make it better in the next decade if we start now. But here's my point. Why don't we just be honest with Australians? They're not stupid. But if we feed them this PR stuff, don't worry, I'll just do this and you'll all be right. We're doing a disservice to all Australians, and we've got to be honest with people.
Yeah, well, I don't want to sound too self-righteous, but I agree with you. I don't know why they deviate. This would be called an enormously naive political statement, but why they wouldn't default to the truth on this stuff? Because if I put myself in the mindset of a voter out there, I wouldn't mind if they said we've stuffed up. I would find it so refreshing if the government said, "Yep, actually we have gone down the wrong path here, but there is a way we can turn this around. It'll take 10 years. I probably won't even be here as the Premier, but that would be so powerful." And they just seem so unwilling to. And I've done the exact. I mean, I'm living proof. I've done the exact same thing in my electorate. I'll put my hand up, and I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I'm on over 7. I got almost 80% of the vote last 2 elections ago. So it's
This is where I think some of the
untested as a method. It doesn't hurt too much.
I'm keen at the political level to support independence. Both parties are stuck in a model. Both major parties are stuck in a model that is adversarial and short term. And that's why I'm keen on supporting more independence at the federal level, because it allows us to have a different conversation. So we've got some amazing politicians in both parties, they're both big ones, but they're trapped. And they say to me, look, we're only allowed to talk about 3 things in a week, and I understand the game, you've got to stick with the political message. But that stops things being discussed. At the federal political level, you've got people like Jackie Lambie saying exactly what she thinks, and I've spent time talking to Jackie in the past, and I respect her. But of course, the independents never have the resources the big parties have. So, as Jackie said to me once, they're running around with their hair on fire, trying to go through all the process at the federal political level without the support process. So it's very difficult, but I still think we need more independents up there. So we have a very different conversation in Parliament, and they're going to have a few more compromises away from purely a single party view, because that's probably the only way we're going to address the problems we've got coming at us.
To put a political turn on this again, is the irony for me is I entered politics seeing myself as a counterpoint, on a high level, as a counterpoint to the obsession with free markets and competition being the answer for everything. But the one thing that the major parties abhor, perhaps more than anything, is competition in the Parliament. So they're absolutely obsessed with competition in the economy, but they're not very obsessed with competition in the Parliament. And I agree. I mean, some of those I think intentions of neoliberalism great to breed competition, can breed some good results in some cases, and but they think there should just be 2 parties governing for the rest of eternity, and it's a wonderful irony.
The free market competition is an important model. The global trading system is an important model. I think we've kidded ourselves as a rules-based order, because when 2 of the major corporate countries in the world, Russia and China, don't agree with our Western idea of a rules-based order, then there isn't a rules-based order. But the free market's very important. It will change quite fundamentally because of the war and everything that's happening. Where it's appropriate, great. You don't want government owning everything. It'll be chaos like it used to be. But in certain areas, you need a little bit of government investment interest and ability to have sufficient control over things, where our security as a nation is important, or where our survival of our society is important. So it's not everything, but we've got to work out, well, where do we have to have a bit? And with fuels, I've given an example. Could we get, say 30% of our supply at least under a high degree of Australian control, and the rest can be a very of trusted, and then the last bit, well, it's just the free market. Is there a way of doing it? We think there is, because other countries do it, but it's a bit of a change in philosophy. But yes, some things are going to cost us more. But I've got to tell you, if we don't prepare for what's coming, because we want to go the cheapest way to get there, when it goes wrong, it's going to cost us a lot more than it would have if we prepared. Same thing with fires and floods. If you prepare, it's going to cost us more money. If you don't, the repairs are going to cost even more. And we're seeing that with the amount of money the government allocates to flood and disaster recovery versus the amount of money they flood to put into prevention. It's like 10 times in recovery than in prevention. That balance is wrong, and we've got to think about how do we help people avoid the disaster or manage their way through it, not just recover.
Yeah. And look, I've got to say, John, I think you're being pretty kind, and probably myself included. I think we're being pretty kind and being moderate here and painting a positive light on what we can do and being constructive moving forward. But, I mean, it is important, I think, to enter the consciousness of the people how serious the consequences are. If not, if you can't feed yourself or you can't you're talking about some pretty serious disruptions.
And people have asked me,
for me that lives in a remote area,
some of the stuff we've written and the reports we've done on the National Resilience Project, which are on my website and our institute's website, you read this, you can get a bit depressed. And people said to me, well, you're slitting your wrist or something. I said, no. The 250 people we had involved in, which was everything from farmers to ICU specialists to academics to ICUs to industry to unions, all over the place. I mean, one of our workshops was great. One of the farmers was hand feeding a couple of baby goats that had been sort of rejected by their mother. And we're in talking about these issues, and she's there feeding the goats, and she went to turn off the video stream and said, no, don't. It's the best thing we've seen all the time we've done the project. Yeah. So we've got a real diversity of views coming in there, but I've got to tell you, what really gives me optimism is I'm so impressed by the people that we had involved. They're smart, they're really concerned about these issues, they're thinking about it. So we've got all the bits to sort this out if we just do a couple of things. One is demand better political leadership, and also, as we've been saying recently, Admiral Chris Barry and myself were talking yesterday on an interview about the climate impacts. We said, look, this is probably one of the most important elections in our lifetime, because we are at a very difficult point in life. And if we don't ensure that we vote in the politicians who, A, understand or accept there is a problem and are open to thinking about what to do about it, if they're not like that and they just say, no, we've got everything under control, don't worry, then it's up to us who we vote for. Don't vote for people who aren't prepared to address these problems seriously and who keep on wanting to say she'll be right, because otherwise we are going to be in a mess. So we've got the control over it, and this next election is very, very important. Yeah,
okay. Back on the ethanol for us, the KAP, we own the mandate for 4%. We put that in the Parliament and it got adopted, and the government has, in a number of ways, demonstrated they just have no intention of all at enforcing that in the oil companies, which I guess in retrospect you'd expect that big companies get to do whatever the hell they want, and so we're still squandering around 2%, I think, there. But I think that's that political will, that manifestation of that political will, or the lack thereof.
But you're probably finding a specific point here about ethanol, which is important. Yeah. You need to build your argument into the broader one about why biofuels beyond that are really important. They're an important part. How that fits into energy security as a part of the solution, how that affects the Queensland economy in this case, and how that makes that the whole countryside, the people out there, are more resilient. Some of the farming communities I was reading about in New South Wales, people had LPG cars. And then some of the big fuel distributors said, it's not really economical, and they shut off the supply. This is in country New South Wales. Well, what are these people going to drive 50 miles to top up an LPG? No, they're not. So we've got to make sure that we understand the vulnerabilities, and that's just one example, and make sure we go, hang on, don't just let the market start removing things and people are left up high and dry. That's going to be a problem for all of us if we don't keep an eye on this.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I've learnt from you today, John, just coming to the end, is you're one of the first people with credentials like yours that's been, those real high levels of government or influence in Australia that's mentioned the imperative of decentralising and the pressure. And like I said, in the news last week, front and centre of the news was how we need to improve livability in Brisbane and focus on just managing this exponential growth in Brisbane rather than, it's always interesting for me when they say, that housing's a problem in Sydney, we can't the affordability, and I think, well, do what I did and move to Mount Isa when I could afford a house. I don't
Yeah.
I don't see what the problem is. There's plenty of affordable places. It's just not right 20 kilometres from the CBD of Sydney where you want to
Yeah.
live.
As we're
You know,
doing now, we've learned you can work from. I mean, in this whole lockdown, what I've been doing, this study was all via Zoom. It saved us $30,000 a year in transport costs. We had
wow.
people from around Australia and the world participating, not just in our local town or where we went. So look, whilst Zoom and these video can be a bit of a pain at times, there's a way that we don't have to live in the big cities. And if you think about designing our way of life, away from the crowds and that sort of stuff, distributing it, distributed power systems make sense, distributed population bases make sense, because then you have the ability to utilize that land more effectively. But a lot of people have this idea of tree changes. Well, let's think about a bit of design for our society and why it's so important. And yeah, living in a city's got benefits, got huge negatives as well.
Yeah. Well, John, look, you've been a powerful voice in not only influencing government, industry, and now just the general public, and really appreciate the job you do. And I don't think you mentioned it, but you're self-funded. It's not like
No.
you're getting paid for a lot of the work that you do. So we really appreciate the work you've done over the years and the positions or at least those things you've just shone the spotlight on that hopefully can help people like myself turn things and tweak. Well, at least turn those. The direction of the ship in government, that we can make a real change. So really appreciate the work you've done.
Thanks, Robbie. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And look, it takes all Australians to get on board with this. What you're doing there is really important. Keep in touch. Let us know how it goes. And hopefully together, as Australians, we can actually make our situation a little bit better.
Down to you. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Robbie. Appreciate it.